And now it's time for Question Time, introduced by David Dimbleby.
Good evening. Tonight we're in Belfast, and our audience, a cross-section of the public who've come to question and put their views to the politicians and public figures who are going to be around our table. Our first guest, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Sir Patrick Mayhew. Patrick Mayhew is a barrister and a former Attorney General. He gave John Major his first job as his parliamentary private secretary when he was at the Home Office. And John Major returned the compliment by giving Patrick Mayhew the only job he'd always wanted to do, this one in Northern Ireland. His mother's family are Anglo-Irish. They settled in Cork, in the Republic, in the 13th century. Next, Labour frontbencher who speaks on women's issues, Claire Short. Claire Short's roots are also Irish. She's long campaigned for a united Ireland. She's very much her own woman. She's resigned twice from Labour's front bench, once over the Prevention of Terrorism Act, once over the Gulf War. She wants more women to change the face of the House of Commons, and at least 80 of them Labour, by preventing some constituencies from choosing men as their candidates. Our third panellist, the Director of the Institute of Professional Legal Studies at Queen's University, Belfast, Mary McAleese. Mary McAleese comes from a large Roman Catholic family which has witnessed its share of sectarian violence. She's lived both in the north and the south. She stood once as a Fianna Fáil candidate in Dublin. A colleague says her demure academic appearance conceals a rat-trap intellect. And next, the Honorary Secretary of the Ulster Unionist Party, Dr. Chris McGimpsey. Chris McGimpsey is a historian. He was educated in Belfast, in New York, and in Edinburgh. He's a regular visitor to the south, and now an Ulster Unionist councillor representing a working-class ward in West Belfast. He's also a property developer, and he says that if he lived in Britain, he'd vote Labour. Well, now, just a reminder that none of our panel know the questions that are going to be put to them tonight. They come as a complete surprise. Let's have the first one, which comes from the Reverend Mervyn MacLean, as a Church of England priest and head of religious education at Banbridge Academy.
Does the panel think society sets too high moral standards for people in public office?
Claire Short.
No, I don't think that at all. I think people are very reasonable, and just as they are with their neighbours and friends. We all have to try to be good and decent, and sometimes we're not as good as we should be. But people hate hypocrites. And if people in public life are preaching at people and, for example, denouncing single-parent families as though they're sort of immoral burden on the country, and then it is revealed that they've created lots of single parents themselves, people get very angry, and quite rightly. Hypocrisy is vile.
Patrick Mayhew.
I don't think that society does set too high standards. I think it's quite difficult to know what standards it does set, because there seem to be varying applications of whatever standards people have in mind. I believe rather firmly that if you do set yourself up to be a leader and you invite the compliment of being elected to represent people, then you are, however illogical it may seem, and you can construct quite a good intellectual case against it, you are expected to set a lead in that field as well. What I do hope we might see is perhaps a little less obsession with this subject at the moment, because I do think there are quite a lot of more interesting and very much more important things going on in the world.
Mary McAleese, do you believe that society expects a higher standard, the implication of this perhaps, too high moral standards from people in public life?
I think it expects it, and so often we're very badly let down. I think that so often we are sold very, very short, and we're expected to settle for a lot less than we are entitled to expect. And I think part of the reason for that is that people have been led to believe that things like integrity and decency are divisible, that you can have a public persona and a private persona, and that those two people don't have to be integrated into one whole, and that you can do things in public life and pretend to be things, create images about your integrity and your decency in public life, and then do something quite different in private, and that one is not entitled to comment or to insist that those two lives be integrated. And I think that the public are entitled to expect that integrity should flow from the human person, from the human soul, and flow outwards and not be divisible. So often I think that we're just so badly let down, and we're shattered when we discover what emptiness lies behind the facade.
What do you think of that, Mervyn McLean, you asked the question. What do you think of that answer?
I think the answer is very fine. I would prefer to see society bring its own moral standards up to the level it expects of its politicians.
You think there's a gulf between what's expected of politicians and what is expected of ordinary people of themselves?
Very much so.
Could you just explain in what way?
Well, I think we accept many things in our society, such as extramarital activities, people cheating on their income tax, people doing the double, and all other kinds of factors like that, libelous things in the press against people who can't defend themselves. And I think there are many aspects of society which indicate low moral standards, and I don't see why we should expect more of politicians. I think we should expect more of ourselves.
Chris Mjimsy.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. I think, first of all, you have the situation that you know, with politicians, I think that, I mean, to whom much is given, much is expected. And I think sometimes in private life, I think sometimes the public expect too much of politicians and forget that politicians are human beings like everyone else. So you do have a situation of the basic humanity of people who sit, say, in the House of Commons, for example, sometimes being exposed when they err in judgment or if they make mistakes, and people are then quick to point the finger. I think possibly it should be said that many of the elements in the media who are the quickest to point the finger at politicians or people in public life about certain errors that they make are probably people who would not stand up to the same sort of scrutiny that the politicians have to face. And I think we should bear that in mind. Having said that, if a politician is about anything, he should have principles, and he should be leading to an extent, at least, hopefully all of the time, or certainly most of the time, by example. And unfortunately, on occasion, some of our politicians, the sort of examples they set us aren't always the sort of things that we would expect other people to lead.
If your argument was right, it wouldn't matter that the journalists didn't have the same standards, because you're saying politicians should set an example, and they're therefore, in a sense, asking to be judged.
Well, yes, I am saying that, but they're not mutually exclusive. What I'm saying is that some elements in the media, who are the ones who jump the hardest on politicians and people in public life, and who will pontificate the most about mistakes or falls from grace, are people who themselves are probably less able to face the sort of public scrutiny that the politicians themselves are forced to face.
I'd like to say another thing, David. The media and the tabloid press think that the only moral question is sex. I mean, there's all sorts of lying and fiddling around money and pretending to do things for big reasons when people are really being selfish and lining their own pocket and being deceitful, that I think is about real integrity in politics. Of course, there's morality about sexual behaviour as well, but that's never mentioned. And the media aren't interested in that. And
sex sells newspapers.
And the same newspapers that make sex sleazy and vile and belittle it, then they pretend to denounce any kind of sexual misbehaviour, and there's a deep hypocrisy there as well.
But you may have seen a former Conservative MP, Matthew Parris, writing in the Times this week, saying that the actual business of going into politics makes people embrace hazard, in his words, as a means of escape, that it is a profession that attracts people who have doubts about themselves or uncertainties, who look to it. They said it, being an MP feeds your vanity and starves your self-respect. Patrick Mayhew.
Well, I've never found that particular attraction in politics. I've found plenty of other attractions in politics, but I've never found it particularly attractive that you live on the edge of a precipice, which seems to be Matthew Parris's thesis. I don't go along with that at all. I think I'd just like to add one little thought to this interesting discussion, and it's this, that you face here a conflict between people who do expect, and I've already said I think they're right, they do expect their politicians to set a particular lead and not to represent the mass of frail mortality in this way. And at the same time, ever more increasingly, people are selected to the candidates on the basis that they are ordinary people just like us. And there's a conflict there.
Does anybody...
I don't know if that's true, David. I mean, I'm not sure that I agree with Sir Patrick there. I think that very often politicians hold themselves out as representing an image, an acceptable image. I take, for example, the family values argument. A number of people have made the running on family values, and I think it's particularly true in the Conservative Party and the Tory Party, and they have stood for that. And not everybody fiddles tax, not everybody has extramarital affairs. There are, I would say, the backbone of this country are good, ordinary, decent people living good lives of real integrity. They are the people who fall for the image, vote for the person, and then feel a very deep, deep sense of not just resentment, but real hurt then when that person does not live up to the image. And in fact, never was going to live up to the image because image is all it ever was.
But what should they do then, these candidates for parliamentary office? If you're saying you believe they should have these very high standards and the electorate expects them of them, if they don't know whether they can live up to them or not until they're elected in the House of Commons, and then they're under all sorts of pressure. I mean, what would you suggest they do? Say in their electoral address?
If they're doing things...
Don't trust me, you say in your electoral
If they're preaching
address.
one thing and living another, there's something wrong. Yeah. And if they think their life is okay, then what they preach in their politics should be in tune with how they live their life.
Is there anyone in the audience listening to this who doesn't agree with that view, who thinks that too high a standard is expected of politicians, higher than we expect of ourselves? Anybody have any? Yes, down here in the front.
I would like to know how many politicians who could be very good politicians if given the chance refuse to get into mainstream politics because there are too many skeletons in the closet, and they would be very, very wary about them being exposed if they put themselves in that position.
Chris McGimsey, what do you think of that?
Well, I mean, how would you quantify that? I just don't know how many
skeletons
politicians don't get involved. I mean, I think it depends on who you would ask. I imagine everybody has skeletons in the closet, and one man's skeleton is not necessarily another one's. But I mean, politics in Northern Ireland, certainly local government, is not the same as being a politician in the House of Commons. Certainly, you talk about politicians about feeding their vanity. I mean, being a Belfast City Councillor is not always a pastime which feeds your own vanity. I mean, I've got to say that. But it is difficult when you have a situation where people are always ready to jump and to question you and to try and judge you. And you have to be, I suppose, extra careful about all sorts of things. And I'm not talking about anything either illegal or immoral. But nevertheless, I do believe on occasions that politicians, whilst they should be leading by example, A, don't, and B, when they aren't, some of the people who are the least, would you say, least likely to be accurately reflecting your failures are the sort of people that are immediately jumping on the bandwagon.
Patrick Mayhew, Emma Nicholson, one of your colleagues in the House of Commons, said about your party, it's time we dropped the back to basics slogan. It has too many sad connotations for us. Do you think in the light of the reality, we needn't go into the details of the events of the last few weeks and months, that it would be a good idea if back to basics was dropped as a sort of moral campaign?
Well, I think it would be a good idea if back to basics was properly understood in the sense in which it was first used by the Prime Minister and as the background to the Conservative Party conference. What was intended and what was made clear was that the party ought to be aligning itself with the basic anxieties and concerns of the people of our country. I think there's been, as Douglas Hurd was saying not very long ago, people have right across the world, and in particular in our own country, have come to think of politicians as following great metropolitan fads and losing touch with the ordinary people who elect them. And they want the politicians to get back to the ordinary things that worry people: security in the home and in the streets,
yes,
proper standards and all the rest.
We know what the politics of back to basics was. Emma Nicholson says it's an unfortunate slogan because it has the wrong connotation now.
Well,
in the context of events
I think that if it's properly understood and explained, I should want to keep it because it struck a great chord.
Right. Some views from our audience there. Yes.
I'd like to introduce a new slogan: "Back to politics." I think. I personally have thoroughly fed up with the mixture of morals and politics. If politicians would concentrate on the business of running the economy, I'd personally be a hell of a lot happier.
Anybody else with a view on this? Over there on the far right, if you can. Yes?
Yes. I think that it's not so much that we as ordinary working class people think that the politicians are doing wrong. I think what makes me very angry and other people like me is that when you don't have much money to live on and they are saying this is what you live on, this is what we tax you on, and people get very bitter and very angry when there's poverty and unemployment. And it's not so much we're setting them up as a high standard, it's like there is one law for the rich and one for the poor.
Right, let's okay, one brief comment from the back, then we'll go on.
We do expect that people in public life really are too high. I think the regrettable thing is that the people in public life fail to meet the standards, and they show an abysmal example to young people, and I think they should think carefully before they get themselves into the situations they do.
I think that's right.
Thanks so much. Okay, go on.
Just apropos of that, and I don't want to rub salt in the wound of what happened this week in relation to Stephen Milligan, but just apropos of that, my 11-year-old daughter the other evening, just simply watching a news bulletin, asked me why a man would be wearing tights. I really don't see why a parent should have to explain to an innocent 11-year-old the circumstances in which this person came to die. Now, it may very well be that when it all evens out, that the story will be much more benign. But even if it's not, one still had to confront that with an 11-year-old child, and frankly, I think that that is utterly unacceptable.
And our next question from Andrew Meads, who's an economist.
What actions should the British and Irish governments take if Sinn Féin or the IRA refuse to accept the Downing Street Declaration?
Patrick Mayhew.
We should go on with the constitutional talks between all the constitutional parties here in Northern Ireland and the two governments to work to find, it may take a long time, but to work to find that overall political accommodation that deals with all the relationships that affect Northern Ireland and get through to an agreement. I think that there's a great surge of popular feeling that wants the politicians to talk together to find a less antagonistic, a more tranquil, a more prosperous way of living together here in Northern Ireland. We go on with that.
An agreement that may exclude Sinn Féin and the IRA altogether, you mean?
Sinn Féin exclude themselves. Nobody's excluding Sinn Féin except themselves. They hold the key, and if they put it in the lock and say we are going to give up justifying violence in this democracy for political ends, then that lock will turn, but the door won't open by any other means. They've got to give that up.
Chris McGimpsey.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I think the first point is it possible for the IRA to give up violence? I'm not sure at the moment that it is. I mean, once they gave up violence, by definition, they would cease to be the IRA, and I don't know if they're at that position yet. But I mean, I can't see a multinational, multi-million-pound organisation which has been had such an effect on people's lives, not only in Northern Ireland, but throughout the rest of these islands, over the last 25 years, suddenly deciding that it's going to change tack. But clearly, irrespective of what happens, I think, first of all, there can be no place at the conference table with democratic politicians for representatives of paramilitary groups while they continue to practice violence and to argue for violence and to support and encourage violence. Now, if at some time in the future the IRA were to eschew violence, were to hand in their weapons, they were to turn their back forever on violence, I mean, they wouldn't need their weapons if they turned their back on violence. By that stage, by definition, they would have ceased to have been paramilitaries. And at that stage, well, then I think people would start to look at the possibility of getting them at the table.
But the question is what the government should do if they don't accept the Downing Street Declaration, which, of course, says they have to give up violence.
Well, you know, we had 2 years of constitutional talks between the four major parties in Northern Ireland, and we did reach a fair degree of agreement on how Northern Ireland should be governed. The internal governance of Northern Ireland was to a very large extent agreed. Now, what has happened since then with the Hume Adams talks is that all the gaze has been directed towards paramilitaries and terrorists. What I think we should be doing now is we should be saying they've had their chance, the line has been drawn in the sand, and at this stage now, if they do not accept almost within the next, I think it's got to be within the next few weeks, well then we've got to put the efforts back into the constitutional parties, and we've got to get the constitutional parties together to work out some formation for the government of Northern Ireland, because whilst we cannot, as constitutional politicians, declare peace, by working out an equitable settlement that both sections of our community can buy into, we can help to set the preconditions for peace. And that is the way I think we should be going forward.
Mary McAleese.
I wish I believed that, Chris, and I can understand why you would feel that so passionately, but I would come out from a different perspective, and I would say that the chances of the constitutional politicians being able to sell to their constituents anything approximating to an agreed settlement, even to get to that point, where there was a background of continuing violence, because the violence, it seems to me, constantly keeps open the raw wound of hatred in Northern Ireland. And it doesn't allow people the opportunity to get beyond hatred, to get towards development, to get towards consensus. And I would fear that in an environment where the violence was continuing, that hatred would still be being stirred up, and that we would then be binding our politicians hand and foot in anger not to agree. And that would be my big fear. And so I think that it's worth the effort at the moment to continue to hope and to continue to pray and to work to bring Sinn Féin on board. Because I do believe that if they were on board, and I frankly don't see how they cannot come on board, I think this declaration is acceptable to people. I think it offers the prospect for us to move together, to develop and to move together as one community and not two very bitterly divided and hate-filled communities. I don't see how they can. They have acknowledged, as I understand it, they've acknowledged that they simply cannot win this war militarily. That being so, even from their perspective, what morality beyond self-indulgence can possibly justify the continuation of this war? That being so, I think that I don't see it as a hopeless case argument. I think that if you look, for example, at Gerry Adams' victory tour of New York, for want of a better expression, last week, he didn't go over and preach war. He went over and he preached, he talked peace, and I wonder how acceptable would he have been had he gone over and preached the gospel of the war. I'm not sure that he would have been just as well lionized.
He was using the sort of language he did in New York?
I don't know. I mean, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt to some extent, and I'll say this, I think we have to this extent, because he's the person that we're all expecting to deliver Sinn Féin and the IRA, and I sincerely hope that when he says he can, he can.
Are you saying that a government that is clearly becoming impatient about not getting a reply should be infinitely patient, or do you set some sort of time limit to a reply coming from the IRA?
I think patience is a virtue in this case, and I think there is nothing to be gained from setting artificial deadlines. Meaningless deadlines. One can see all sorts of deadlines in the offing. I mean, we're coming up to an election campaign. Once election campaigns start, people go back into their trenches. So it would be nice to have that all sewn up and tied up neatly before we get into the European election scenario. That may not happen. And in a way, I mean, I think that we have faced into a hurricane in Northern Ireland. The last 25 years have been, if anything, a major hurricane. And I would take advice from those who sail ships in hurricanes, and it is that you sail into it, you reduce your speed, and you keep a steady course. And I think that's what the governments of both this country and the Republic of Ireland are involved in, steadying, if you like, the ship, and steering a very steady course with the eye on the ball of peace. And that involves Sinn Féin.
Claire Short.
I think I agree that the Downing Street Declaration is a completely reasonable offer. I think if the IRA don't accept it, they're absolutely and completely morally, politically and historically bankrupt. It's quite clear the reason for the delay is that the organisation is divided. I don't know this, but this is what we all hear. And Adams actually thinks they should go for it. So say they don't go for it, how bankrupt will they be? Everyone can see that their own leading figure doesn't actually believe in what they're doing anymore. So they should go for it for everybody's sake and for their own decency's sake. I know, people would say they don't have any. I mean, the IRA have packed in before. After the 60s campaign, they packed in. I agree there might be a small number who are sort of committed to this, just shooting people, and they think that's politics, which it isn't. So it's a fantastically important historical opportunity for everybody, and it's right to nurture it and to try to achieve it.
What do you think it offers them, the Downing Street Agreement?
It offers everybody dignity in the historical journey of how Northern Ireland got here. Everybody's tradition is understood. And then it says it's democratic politics. Everyone can argue whatever they want about the border, but no more guns. And then let the population decide and let democracy decide. But Britain's changing its posture. It is. And I think Peter Brooks and then you have done that. And that has been a very important contribution to the new political space. But if they don't, and it looks a bit pessimistic, now. I mean, I don't have any inside information, but the time is going on. Then what has to be done is that we have to keep trying. I agree. But the two governments, North and South, have to carry on cooperating about economic development. The woman there, I mean, the levels of poverty and unemployment in this part of Ireland helps to feed young men being willing to do all those things, who need some hope and some other chances in their life and a chance of being a decent person and having another way of going. The two governments need to cooperate. The politics of Northern Ireland need to try to grow up and not be trapped in the bitterness of the violence. I just read that book, May God in His Mercy Be Kind to Belfast. It's a very sad book, and it shows that thing you were talking about, that if people are dying and killing each other, people are entrenched in bitterness.
So why wouldn't they
of
be?
course.
They're full of hurt.
Andrew Meads, who asked the
But,
question.
one other thing-
no, Andrew Meads, what
one
do you
other thing-
think?
no, the
No,
British-
let me bring in Andrew Meads, and then we'll come back to you, Claire. in a
Okay,
moment.
Well, I actually agree almost entirely with Claire Short. The one thing that I would say is I've lived in Northern Ireland for 1.5 years, and in the time I've been here, the majority of the killings have actually been by so-called loyalists, and I actually wonder if all this emphasis on getting IRA and the Sinn Féin to accept the Downing Street Declaration actually leaves out a huge part of the equation in bringing peace to this part of the world.
Let me take somebody else then on what the government should do if there isn't an acceptance. Yes, the man at the back there, the spectacles on.
I can't understand Mary McAleish's position whatsoever. Her naivety is incredible. It is not just the violence of the IRA which is repugnant to the greater number of the people in Northern Ireland, it's their politics as well. Even if you could get them round the conference table, they have nothing to contribute. They know that any solution which they can agree to is unacceptable to most people in Northern Ireland. That's why they're going to carry on bombing and killing.
Mary McAleish.
That would be a problem for me if that was your point of view, because I was talking essentially from a nationalist perspective, as a nationalist and who believes that constitutional nationalism is a laudable objective, is something that one can be perfectly sincere about, and that one is entitled to respect for, even from those who disagree.
County socialist republic.
Well,
Yes, but
let me just talk about.
argue that.
I have no problem. I have.
Losing elections.
If they want to come around the table and discuss a 32-county democratic or socialist republic, I think that, again, I would respect their point of view, provided that it is not backed up by violence. And one of the things about the Downing Street Declaration that I think is going to be the real test in this community is that it suggests, and in fact it commands us, to learn to respect each other's point of view, even when we violently disagree with it. But we will learn at least to respect it and to deal with each other not in this verbal warfare that so often passes for conversation in Northern Ireland, but to treat each other with some degree of basic human dignity and respect.
The lady at the very back there, yes.
Well, the government must feel very noble waiting all these weeks for an answer from Gerry Adams. I don't know about anyone else, but we've been waiting for 25 years. I would like to add that Mr. Major in elections has put a great deal of credence on the majority vote getting him into power, and whenever there's a vote in the House of Commons, he wants a majority vote. Well, he's got a majority vote in Northern Ireland, and most of the people want to stay British, but he doesn't seem to want to listen to that majority vote.
Okay, so what is your reply to Sir Patrick Mayhew? What do you think he should do if he doesn't get an answer from the IRA?
Well, I think obviously the talks have to go on, but the point that I would make is that we in Northern Ireland are listening to a Conservative government that we don't have any say about. We can't vote for you or Labour. Now that brings on another issue entirely, but what I would say is it's very frustrating to listen to the government of the South and also the government of Great Britain and Northern Ireland discussing an issue that most of us can't even vote about or have any say on because you won't listen to us.
Sir Patrick, yes. Well, Patrick Mayhew, could I just, in this context, ask you also to answer whether it's right or true that the discussions about the future of Northern Ireland, the paper on that, which is soon to be published, has been passed first to the Dublin government before it was shown to Unionists in Northern Ireland?
Yes, I'll deal with that, but I'd like to answer the question up there first. I'm glad to be able to tell you you can vote for Conservative candidates. I very much hope you'll do so in the European election.
I have a great deal of support for Ian Gow, and I actually wrote to Theresa Gorman many years ago and asked her for support in setting up a Conservative association here. Ian Gow was extremely helpful in doing that, and look where it got him.
Well, exactly, and he's got a lot of very fine people into their graves because they stood up for what they believed to be right, and that's what we're trying to rid Northern Ireland and the whole of the United Kingdom of. Now, you can vote for a Conservative government, and I think that's extremely important for a Conservative candidate in any election. I think it would be a very good thing if you could vote for a Labour one, but we wouldn't go further into that because David now says, what about, is it true about these ideas, this paper which you say you're going to put to the parties? Did you send it to the Irish government? The answer to that is, yes, I did. I sent it last Friday. They are partners in the talks process. They are co-chairman of the talks process. And what I'm about is trying to find a way forward to give that talks process something of substance to get hold of. Now, I think that the vast majority of people here in Northern Ireland are putting their faith in it. And I'd like just to say this in conclusion. I've already seen one of the party leaders. I'm going to see the rest in the next day or two at their convenience. But just ending this little answer, I'd just like to say this. It isn't a question of waiting for somebody for Sinn Féin to say, yeah, we accept, or no, we don't. That suggests that something is being held back, which isn't the case. We want to proceed. The talks are proceeding. I want to see them get hold of matters of substance. Meanwhile, the heavy security response to the IRA and to the Loyalists, that's going on just as much as ever before. We're not waiting upon anything. That door is going to remain able to be opened by Sinn Féin, provided they say violence is over.
Another point from the gentleman with spectacles at near the back there, yes.
I find it difficult to believe the Conservative government because they've told lies in the past, and when somebody has challenged them in the House of Commons, they're thrown out of the Commons because they've told the truth. So how can we as a country here have any confidence in a government that tells lies openly, and when somebody tells the truth, they're thrown out?
Well, let me answer that straight away.
What lies are you referring to? Viewers may not know what you're talking about.
Dr. Paisley told them that they were speaking to Sinn Féin, and they denied it constantly. I'd like Mr. Major to answer that one, please.
Well, I'll answer it before
Mr. Patrick Mayhew get better chance of answering tonight.
I'll answer it before Mr. Major does, and he'd give you exactly the same answer. The government said consistently, we are not going to conduct talks, we are not going to negotiate with any organization that supports or perpetrates terrorism. And that has been the case, and we have said that consistently. And we've always said nobody has been authorized on behalf of the British government to enter into talks or discussions or negotiations with any terrorist organization or anybody who justifies it. And that was absolutely true.
Do you believe this, Chris McGimsey?
Well, I must say I have difficulty when you look at this whole long list of correspondence which was passed in communications between our government and the Republican movement, the whole, the conflict is over debate. And I mean, that is very, very difficult to accept, I must say. Having said that, I do accept the basic point that you cannot get involved in negotiations with terrorists while they continue to terrorize people. We do have the potential here in Northern Ireland for logical democratic debate. And people might feel it's not always as logical as it should be, but I mean, you get the politicians you vote for. And there is the opportunity for constitutional nationalism, which, Mary, it's probably worth remembering that Gerry Adams in his book said the term constitutional nationalism was a contradiction in terms.
I didn't read it.
Yeah, well, you didn't, I must say, miss an awful lot.
I'm going to take very, very quickly a couple more points. Yes, you in the very front here.
Surely the basic question is, can the Republic of Ireland afford an additional 1.5 million people? Now, you can have all the romantic ideology about Ireland, but if the answer to that is no, then it ends there.
But the question, I'm sorry to take you back to it, was what action the British and Irish governments should take if the IRA doesn't accept the... Are you on that point? If it doesn't accept the Downing Street Accord or agreement?
It's related to it. What I'm about to say you may think is a bit politically naive, but given that the British Parliament and the Irish Parliament have jointly given away their national sovereignty, if I can put it that way, to the European Parliament, surely what we're discussing here is really overtaken by events, because the whole concept of the nation state, as we understand it, and as people here are aligned with, the extremists, the flags that they actually follow, the Union Jack and the tricolour, are being eclipsed by a blue flag with 12 gold stars around.
We get the point. Claire Short, very brief answer to that.
I think you're right that the nature of the nation is being transformed because the nation state can't control economics and capital anymore, and you need nations to cooperate to get some decent standards for ordinary working people. So now we're in a much more complex politics, where some power is at the European level, still will do some things as our nations, but it makes the conflict in Northern Ireland more and more tragic and backward looking. It doesn't belong to the politics of the future, to the real interests of the people who live here, to where the real battles about the quality of people's lives are going to. I think you're right, basically.
Let's go on now. We have to go on. Vivian Cragen, next question, who's an assistant to the director of a charity.
Does the panel believe that cigarette and alcohol advertisements pressurise young people to start smoking and drinking?
Well, this is in the light, I think, of the Health Minister's rejection of a statutory ban on cigarette advertising at the beginning of this week. Mary McAleese.
To be honest, I'm not sure that advertising carries the weight that perhaps we think that it does. I have a strong aversion to censorship. And at the same time, I'm a non-smoker, and I'm quite a militant non-smoker. I intensely dislike being in smoking atmospheres. And I think that we haven't been ingenious enough in the ways in which we've gone about trying to inhibit people from smoking. For example, I see no reason at all why people who smoke shouldn't be forced to pay more for their seats on airplanes, because they cost more to service, they require more cleaning. I think that when they go into restaurants, they should be required to pay more for the seats they occupy in restaurants, again, because they require more cleaning.
And they contribute $8 billion a year to the exchequer.
It's not half
more,
enough.
More than you.
Which is why the banning. I think they should be cost effective.
Chris Majimsi, I think you've got a confession to make on this one.
Well, I don't know if there's anything to confess. I'm a fairly heavy smoker. I got to admit that. But I actually would ban advertising, certainly, of tobacco. I mean, I don't know if most people here be old enough to remember, you know, You're Never Alone with a Strand ad. And I mean, I can remember the whole image of smoking was something not only mature, but it was fairly debonair and something that people did when you were...
But you are mature and debonair.
Yeah, well, I wasn't at 13, and I aspired to be in the situation, Mary, that I'm in at the moment. And I mean, I'm quite convinced that the sort of mystique about smoking, which was erected by advertising and was put together and was something that I saw as a child, was one of the major factors in me starting smoking. I would love to stop smoking. I do get off it from time to time and get back again, so I would ban it to try and ensure other children don't fall in the same trap I did.
What about the questioner? What would you do?
Well, I think that cigarette smoking advertising has already been toned down quite considerably, and actually I would be worried at the moment more about the advertising of alcohol, which I consider causes a lot of violence.
Who believes the government was wrong not to ban cigarette smoking altogether? Yes, in the middle there. Yeah, you, yeah.
Yes, I do, because...
Stub it out and give us the answer.
Well, I must admit I enjoy a cigarette myself, but I have to say that both the advertising, the way it's glamorised, I think that it gives certain sort of suggestions, particularly to young people, and I think certainly to young women who are also associated with weight loss and things like that. And I think that it is a major influence, and particularly when the government has admitted effectively that they know that they would save thousands of lives a year. It flabbergasts me, frankly.
Claire Short.
You know, we have a vote on this in the House of Commons tomorrow. I mean, I will fly back in the morning to vote for the banning of advertising. I gave up smoking on the 27th of December, and I think I've now given
20th of December, 1993?
Just
now?
A few months.
And
but I've done it.
How's it going?
Fine. I've given up in my head. It's when you really want to. But the evidence from other countries is, and the evidence from young women are smoking in massive numbers, and this glamorizing, you're grown up, you're a macho man, you're a sexy grown-up woman, it's very powerful images. Young people are still taking up smoking in massive numbers, and we can ban advertising, and the evidence from other countries that have done it, of course, smoking doesn't disappear completely, but the number of young people taking it up declines.
Why?
And I think we absolutely should. And the reason the government is opposing us is, remember the last election? It was the cigarette companies that pulled all their adverts off the billboards and put the Tory adverts on every street corner for the election, and they owe them.
Patrick Mayhew, it was said that Michael Heseltine, John Gummer and William Walgrave all called in a leaked memorandum for a statutory ban, and Mr. Heseltine said if the government really wants to demonstrate its commitment to reducing smoking, an outright ban is the credible way forward. Why was it rejected by the Health
I don't know whether there was a leaked document or not. It didn't go as far as me, and if it did, I wouldn't be telling you about it now. I'll tell you what I think. I'm not a smoker, except when somebody gives me a cigar. I wouldn't go out and buy one, but I do enjoy smoking a cigar, provided it's been given to me. Now, I think I agree with Mary
a mean smoker.
A mean smoker. I agree with Mary McAleese that this is a difficult and a pretty nicely balanced question. I share her dislike of telling people, of interfering with people's choice. Equally, I see the public interest side of it. I think it's about right at the moment. It's not on visual television. You have it on the boards, and I, personally, speaking for myself, I think it should stay there. And I will confess this, that with responsibility for things that happen here in Northern Ireland, I'm going to confess this to you. I certainly put into the scales the fact that there are 1,200 people who have jobs in Ballymena at Gallagher's.
Right, I'm going to ask you, the audience, on a show of hands on this. The questioner says cigarettes and liquor, cigarette and alcohol advertising, does it pressurize young people to start smoking and drinking? The implication being perhaps that if it does, it should be banned. Those of you who think it does put pressure on young people, could you just show your hands? And keep them there if you'd like to see advertising banned on those things. Right, and those of you who don't believe it has that effect? Rather minority, shrinking. Why don't you think it has any effect?
I think people should be given the choice and should be given the benefit of the doubt that they're intelligent and they can make up their own mind.
You're a young person. Are you a smoker or a drinker?
Yes.
Both?
No,
Both.
no, not a smoker. Not a smoker.
Right, okay. Let's go on that point to the next question, which comes from Felicity Huston, who's a civil servant.
Will the NATO ultimatum bring about a proper ceasefire in Bosnia? And if the warring parties fail to comply with this, should the aerial bombing go ahead?
Will the NATO ultimatum bring about a proper ceasefire in Sarajevo or in Bosnia? And if the warring parties fail to comply, should the aerial bombing go ahead? Claire Short.
There's no chance that the threat to bomb, if they won't stop mortaring Sarajevo, will bring about a total ceasefire. Well, the best that we hope for is that, you know, Sarajevo and a number of other cities were declared safe areas by the United Nations, and then people are just being slaughtered, and it's been going on, people in bread queues, you know, there were children before that were being evacuated, if you remember. So the best is that they'll stop slaughtering people in the cities. That won't, I mean, that's better than nothing. I think European policy on Bosnia is an absolute disaster. I think people who are gravely breaching international law, deliberately using ethnic cleansing and vileness to change international boundaries, evil fascist ideas that are being allowed to succeed. I think in our own interest, not just the morality and international law, we're making a terrible error. We're going to have our own Gaza Strip in Europe, 2 million refugees. There'll be European Muslims angry, and quite rightly angry. But I'm glad of this limited commitment to bomb the people who are mortaring savagely people in Sarajevo. But it's a little thing, and we should have done much more, much earlier.
When I started this programme, Claire Short, I said that you'd resigned from the front bench of the Labour Party over the Gulf War. Do you believe British forces are legitimately engaged here in this war, then?
Well, they're not engaged. They're delivering humanitarian aid.
But they will be engaged, won't they, if bombing starts on the hills around Sarajevo?
I actually believe that the Serbs who've ducked and dived, they've always backed off when threatened. They'll back off. They'll move the weapons. No one will bomb anyone. 6 weeks down the road, it'll all be going on again, I think is what is going to happen. And I think Britain has been one of the most tardy of taking on the evil behaviour in Bosnia, and I think it's been a grave error, and I think the consequences in European history, the encouragement to every petty fascist dictator in the former Soviet Union and so on, will have repercussions in our history going on for a long time. I think it's a terrible disaster.
Mary McAleese, do you believe that the bombing should go ahead if the warning is ignored, or the ultimatum of NATO to the Serbian
I do not.
Troops to move their guns isn't observed?
I do not. I do not believe it will achieve the objective of a ceasefire. I think Serbia is bent on genocide. I think that genocide is absolutely evil, and I think it does call and has called for a very long time for a robust response from the international community. It did not get that because the international community was too fragmented and not focused, and only responded every time there was a major incident. And to tell you the truth, I think that what's happening this week has been a very cynical exercise, because I have an awful suspicion that the threat of strikes, the threat of a military strike against Serbian posts is less to do with trying to control the aggression of Serbia and more to do with trying to save the face of NATO. And that's what frightens me, that it's a knee-jerk reaction. It's NATO. I just looked at them the other day and I saw these serried ranks of old, tired men with old, tired mechanisms for solving the world's problems, which are always down to violence at the end of the day. And I don't see that as the answer. I see the danger of NATO getting involved then as emasculating the UN role in relation to peacekeeping, and indeed maybe making that particular role, very important role they play, impossible to carry out. And again, I will go back to the analogy with the hurricane. I think that you steer a very, very steady course. The other big fear that I have is that while clinical or surgical strikes, as I think they call them, sound attractive, I would just be worried at the vulnerability of ordinary, decent people who are living in the areas in which these guns are. I don't know that they can be so tightly targeted as to take out the thing that is causing the problem.
Patrick Mayhew.
Don't forget that it's at the request of the United Nations Secretary General that NATO has taken this step yesterday. I agree that there is a risk, and that is why I disagree with Claire, who says we should have gone in much sooner. A year ago, we were very, very much concerned that it was going to put at unacceptable risk the soldiers that we've had there for more than a year on humanitarian duties, trying to get these convoys through. Now, the United Nations has asked NATO to use air power against the Serbs when asked to do so by the United Nations military commander. And we've now decided to do that. And a lot of people say, well, what's changed? Well, I think what has changed has been we've had another year of this, and there was, let's not fail to face the fact, this terrible attack in Sarajevo the other day. And I believe public opinion wants this to happen. The answer to the question is I don't know if it's going to enforce the ceasefire. And as to the second part of the question, should it, what will happen if it doesn't? That must depend upon the military advice of the United Nations commander.
Some would argue that it's policy making by television pictures, because thousands of people have been killed. The fact that 68 are killed in one particular strike, is that sufficient grounds for changing government policy and NATO's policy and the United Nations policy and the American president's policy?
I don't think that you should disregard public opinion merely because nowadays it is actually given an opportunity to be founded upon what it sees to be happening. I don't see why that somehow makes it invalid. Of course, you don't take the temperature every minute and see what the polls are doing, but I think that you do have a feel for what public want, a feel for public revulsion, and I believe that these are events which reach a kind of watershed, and I believe that is what has happened. The balance has come down, with the risk still there, but the balance has come down in favor of doing what the United Nations asks us.
Chris McGimsey.
Well, I agree. I think that we should be going in and we should be targeting the Serbian emplacements around Sarajevo. I think there are a number of questions we've got to ask ourselves. First of all, why is it taking so long? And I think, once we actually go in and take this action, if it works and if it stops the Serbs from the slaughter of Muslims in Sarajevo, we have got to say to ourselves, how many more lives could we have saved? I think the West has tinkered around with this issue. We've had hours on the TV of, half a dozen youngsters being taken out in a plane, which is a wonderful thing. But it's literally just tinkering at the edge. And one of the questions that I wonder is, I wonder if it was Muslim guns on the hills firing into a Christian city, would Western Europe have moved much quicker? And I suspect that is an element in it. But I think that we have delayed far too long, and I think that we are right to go in. I think we should be wary about getting into the situation of NATO becoming a world policeman and going in and committing land forces. We don't want another Vietnam situation. But having said that, we should be going in, we should be doing something to eradicate the threat from the Serbian guns around Sarajevo.
Let's Felicity Huston, who asked the question, what's your view?
Well, I certainly think that the bombing should go ahead if they don't produce a proper ceasefire. I think that the policy of appeasement in Bosnia has been as unsuccessful as it is here in Northern Ireland.
And you'd have the bombing go ahead just on this particular city and the hills around this city, or would you have the bombing go ahead right throughout Bosnia to enforce a particular policy on?
Well, I think as far as the Serbs are concerned, threatening bombing Belgrade might be the most effective way of stopping them.
Are you serious?
Well, it might bring it home to them.
Let's have another view. Yes, the gentleman there in the middle.
I think that sometimes we could have fallen asleep during that debate and for Sarajevo put Belfast. And we're talking about exactly the same issues. Is there a resolve to actually get troubles and terrorist units, etc., out of Sarajevo to stop the conflict there? And the answer is you must look at Belfast. It has been allowed to go on in Belfast here for 25 years. There's no resolve here in Ulster to end the troubles. And we talk about getting round the table and respecting each other's views. It's very hard to respect anyone who has a gun at your head, Protestant or Catholic. And we're not just getting at the IRA, but we must differentiate between the two units.
Right,
and if we have a resolve, then peace will come, but there seems to be no resolve.
We're talking about Sarajevo, the lady in the middle there, at the back. Yes, you with the spectacles. It's a gentleman. I'm so sorry. That's the I'm not the first one to have made that mistake.
Oh, really?
Not about you, no. But no, from this chair. Anyway,
I was going to say that I entirely agree with Claire Short, but I wonder also if Bosnia had been an oil-producing nation, whether we wouldn't have gone in a lot earlier.
Is anyone? Let's get a slightly different view.
David, can I just say, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, they breached international law by crossing an international boundary. When we recognised Bosnia, then the Serbian movement was exactly the same breach of international law, and look at the difference. The lack of oil was the explanation.
Is anyone opposed to the use? Yes, in the centre here, the gentleman in the centre.
I'd just like to say that before we bomb anybody, we should bring our boys back home, and then if we want to bomb Bosnia, we can bomb it to Kingdom Come for all I care.
Well, you'll have noticed that the gentleman in the front here.
Remember back at the Second World War, when there were 750,000 Serbs slaughtered by the Roman Catholic Church. That's right. And the Nazis.
But are you against, on this issue of the British government's action?
Surely,
do you think they should?
What I'm saying is, surely the Serbs have a fear there that this sort of thing's going to happen again.
But are you in favour of the British government taking the action and NATO and the United Nations taking? You're not. Right. And the gentleman over there.
The questioner implies that parts of Northern Ireland, or maybe parts of all of Ireland, should be bombed in similar fashion. Could you perhaps expand on that?
Can we stick with Sarajevo? Yes, the gentleman back there.
I think the last thing the former Yugoslavia needs is more bombing, more bloodshed, more heartache.
The what? Sorry, I didn't catch that.
I think the last thing that it needs is more bombing, more military intervention.
I'll take one more. The gentleman at the very back, yes.
On the question of Muslims killing Christians or Christians killing Muslims, and on international boundaries and respect for those boundaries, I'd like to refer to East Timor, for example, and the lack of action on that issue.
Well, anybody could make a... Yes. It's possible to make a very long list of places where violence of this kind is going on. We have to move on, so we're coming towards the end, but since this is a major step that's been taken, could I just take, again, your views as a cross-section of the British public on this issue? Do you believe, those of you who believe it's right for the British government to have gone along with, endorsed the NATO view and the United Nations view that bombing now can be used if the ultimatum isn't accepted? If you agree with that, would you raise your hands? Thank you. But under half of the audience here. How many disagree or opposed to it? Yeah, okay, thanks very much. And a number of don't knows. Let's move on to our last question, which comes from Jonathan McLean, a medical representative. Jonathan McLean.
The RUC is an armed police force. Their arming is vital for both their protection and that of the community. Should the police on the mainland be armed as a general rule, given the increase in violence against them?
So, a question based on the experience of Northern Ireland, but applying to Great Britain as a whole. Chris McGimpsey, do you think that the British police should be armed like the RUC is?
Yeah, and of course the RUC are not the only police force that are armed. There are many police forces in the US. The police force is armed. I think that there is obviously a problem. I mean, there are an awful lot of guns on streets. Forget about the political situation in Northern Ireland for the moment. There's an awful lot of guns about, and in an ideal world, the less guns that are around, the better it's going to be. Having said that, I do believe that we have a situation where there's so many criminals are resorting to the use of arms, and that very often policemen and police women in Great Britain who aren't armed are facing armed and very dangerous and deadly individuals that they have not got the ability to properly defend themselves. So having expressed initially a concern that we're bringing more guns onto the streets, at the same token, I do believe that the police should be in a position where they can defend themselves. And as such, I mean, I think on balance that this issue should be looked at, and I would be inclined to feel that in certain areas that the police should have the right to resort to arms in defence of themselves. I think possibly if there was a greater access to armaments by the police in Great Britain, perhaps you would find criminals less likely to resort to guns. But I mean, we need to be very carefully monitored.
I'll stop you because we have to be brief here. Patrick Mayhew.
A lot of police are armed in Great Britain. They're armed whenever it is thought that they're going to risk danger to their lives, and they are authorised then to carry arms.
But this is a general rule,
but it's against the tradition, and I think I'd leave it to the police in Great Britain to decide. The majority of them, I don't believe, want it. It's against their tradition. I heard the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police saying this yesterday, and I think I'd leave it to them. They're the people who are at risk. I think I'd leave it to them.
Claire Short?
The police in Britain don't want to be armed, and they believe that if they were, all the criminals would get more guns. I mean, we have some armed police, and unfortunately more than we used to have, because there are more criminals with guns. But if you compare Britain with America, we do not want to go there. We don't want everyone, you know, there'd be so many guns in the society. I mean, this police officer was just killed with a knife, and terrible it was. But if they were armed, I guess those criminals would have had guns, and I mean, there wouldn't have been any prospect of him surviving.
Two of you have said that the police don't want to be armed. Mike Bennett, the chairman of the Metropolitan Police Federation, said that after this event this week, I've slowly come around to the view that arming...
I think to surrender that tradition is a major step. It is not something you take lightly, and you certainly don't take it in the aftermath of an incident like this. It's not a good time to make that kind of decision. I must say, I would leave it to the police also.
Jonathan McLean, you asked the question.
Well, I think the problem with selective arming is that terrorists and criminals don't select who they're going to shoot or kill. To excuse the pun, I mean, I think the police should be able to fight fire with fire.
So you'll be in favour of it on the mainland or in Britain?
Yes, I am.
Yes, the gentleman at the back there.
I would say that if the same percentage of police in Great Britain were being killed as in the province, they would have guns tomorrow.
Does anyone believe the British...